The Dark Scrolls. The court of Tudor England was a place where whispers could change a life, and where beauty was both a gift and a curse. In the late 15th century, as Henry VII's reign was drawing toward its close, and his young son Henry was being prepared for a destiny greater than anyone imagined, a child was born who would become a forgotten key to the great Tudor story. Her name was Mary Boleyn. She was the daughter of Sir Thomas Boleyn and Lady Elizabeth Howard, two ambitious figures whose marriage united rising wealth with ancient bloodlines. Mary's father, shrewd and calculating, understood how quickly favor at court could turn into titles and estates. Her mother, descended from the powerful Howard family, brought noble standing and a network of influence that was already embedded deep within the machinery of Tudor power. Mary's childhood unfolded in the shadow of promise. She grew up at Hever Castle in Kent, where she and her siblings were raised not only to read and pray, but to maneuver in the world of courtly display. Unlike her younger sister Anne, who had a sharp wit and a fiery determination, Mary was remembered for her gentleness. Contemporary observers described her as sweet, warm, and tender, with a beauty that carried a softness her sister never possessed. If Anne was fire, Mary was honey, and this sweetness would prove both captivating and perilous. At a remarkably young age, Mary was sent abroad. Like many daughters of noble families, she was dispatched to France to learn refinement at one of the most sophisticated courts in Europe. She became a lady-in-waiting to Queen Claude, wife of King Francis I. There, in the gilded halls of Fontainebleau and Amboise, Mary encountered a world far freer in its sensuality and courtly games than the more restrained English court. Rumors swirled quickly around her. Francis I himself was said to have boasted of his encounters with the English girl, later sneeringly referring to her as the English mare. The insult echoed across time, suggesting she had been used and cast aside. Yet, whether the scandal was entirely true or sharpened by the king's notorious vulgarity, it cemented Mary's reputation as a woman whose charms had drawn the attention of a monarch. When Mary returned to England, she carried with her both the glamour and the stigma of France. She was no longer just the daughter of Thomas Boleyn. She was a woman whose name already provoked curiosity. Around 1520, she married William Carey, a gentleman of the king's household. It was a respectable match, one that tied her family more tightly to Henry VIII's inner circle. Yet not long after, another rumor began to stir, this time far closer to home. Henry VIII, then still in the full vigor of his youth, was known for his wandering eye. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon had not yet soured completely, but the Queen's repeated failures to provide a living son weighed heavily on him. His gaze began to drift toward the women of his court. At some point in the early 1520s, Mary Boleyn became the focus of that gaze. The details are lost in the shadows of history. Henry's chroniclers never recorded the matter directly, and unlike his later mistress, Bessie Blount, Mary was never openly acknowledged. But circumstantial evidence whispers insistently. 2 children entered the world during the years of Mary's intimacy with the king. Catherine Carey, born in 1524, and Henry Carey, born in 1526. Their official father was William Carey, but their births coincided so precisely with Mary's supposed relationship with Henry VIII that suspicion could never be erased. The court buzzed with speculation. Were these children the secret offspring of the king? Henry VIII would later publicly acknowledge only one illegitimate child, Henry Fitzroy, but the favor shown to Catherine and Henry Carey, particularly under the reign of Elizabeth I, seemed to hint at deeper truths. Catherine, in time, became one of Elizabeth's most trusted ladies, her bond with the Queen resembling something closer to family than simple service. Henry Carey, too, would rise, ennobled and secure, his line intertwining with the great families of England. But Mary herself did not enjoy the spoils of royal desire. Once Henry's interest cooled, as it always did, she was discarded back into obscurity. Worse still, she now found herself overshadowed by her younger sister. Anne Boleyn, newly returned from years abroad, stepped into the king's vision with a brilliance Mary could never match. Where Mary had been pliant, Anne was cunning. Where Mary had yielded, Anne resisted. Anne understood that to give in quickly meant to be abandoned quickly. And so she played the dangerous game of withholding, drawing Henry deeper into her snare. As the king's passion for Anne grew, Mary was left adrift, her reputation marked, and her place uncertain. The Boleyn family, ambitious to the core, turned their energies toward Anne. Thomas and Elizabeth Boleyn recognized that Anne's connection to the king could raise their fortunes higher than Mary's fleeting liaison ever had. Mary, once the vessel of hope, was now regarded almost as a liability. Even Anne herself regarded her sister with scorn, as though Mary's compliance had stained the family's honor. Letters and accounts from the time suggest that Anne treated Mary with a mix of disdain and coldness, and that Mary's standing at court diminished rapidly as Anne rose higher. Mary's husband, William Carey, died in 1528 during an outbreak of the sweating sickness, leaving her widowed with 2 young children. The king granted her some relief, but the Boleyn family offered little support. She was left to navigate a precarious position, neither favored mistress nor powerful wife, but a woman on the margins of court life. It was during these years that Mary took a scandalous step of her own. Around 1534, she secretly married William Stafford, a soldier of modest means. The match was one of affection rather than advantage, but it provoked outrage. For a woman of Mary's station, especially the sister of the king's mistress, soon to be queen, such a union was considered disgraceful. When the truth emerged, Anne Boleyn, already ensconced as Henry's consort, erupted in fury. Mary and her new husband were banished from court, their marriage branded an embarrassment. Thus Mary Boleyn faded from the stage of history, condemned to a quiet life far from the tumult of power. She died in 1543, largely forgotten, her name surviving only as a whisper beneath the roar of Anne's tragic downfall. Yet her legacy endured in ways that neither she nor her family could have foreseen. Her children, Catherine and Henry Carey, became crucial allies to Elizabeth I, their loyalty and service strengthening the Queen's fragile throne. Through them, Mary's blood mingled with the currents of English destiny, threading through the generations, reaching even into the veins of later royal houses. Her story is one of shadows and silence, of a woman remembered for her beauty, yet neglected for her worth. Behind every account lies the possibility of secrets unspoken, the mystery of royal bloodlines, the politics of desire, the cruel arithmetic of ambition. Was Mary merely a pawn in her family's rise, or was she the true matriarch of a hidden Tudor legacy? The question lingers, unanswered, drawing us deeper into the labyrinth of rumor and history. And so the tale begins, not with Anne's dazzling ascent or Henry's thunderous wrath, but with Mary, the woman who stood at the threshold of power, who tasted the dangerous intimacy of kings, and whose children would one day stand beside a queen. In her silence lies one of the great enigmas of the Tudor court, how the most forgotten sister became the unseen thread binding a dynasty together. When Mary Boleyn vanished from the stage of Henry's court, many believed her story had ended. In truth, her disappearance only deepened the mystery that surrounds her life. Banished from the glittering chambers where politics and seduction intertwined, Mary slipped into obscurity with William Stafford, her second husband. Their marriage had cost her everything: status, wealth, the fragile security of family alliances, but it had given her something far more precious: a life of her own choosing. In the ruthless world of Tudor ambition, that choice was almost unthinkable. The years after 1534 were marked by silence in the chronicles. Mary, once whispered about as a king's mistress, no longer appeared in the records of masques, progresses, or court intrigues. She had traded her place at the very heart of power for a modest life with a man who offered her loyalty, not influence. But the consequences of her withdrawal rippled outward. For though Mary herself was forgotten, her bloodline remained at the very center of Tudor drama, a hidden current beneath the raging storm that would soon consume her sister Anne. Anne Boleyn had achieved what Mary never could. She had captured and held Henry VIII's obsession long enough to ascend to the throne. By 1533, Anne was Queen of England, crowned amid grandeur and the hope of a new dynasty. She had risked everything, her virtue, her reputation, her family's honor, and in return she had received the glittering crown. But queenship was a perilous seat. The Tudor court was a theater of ambition where yesterday's favorite could become tomorrow's condemned. Anne's triumph carried the weight of expectation. She must give Henry the one thing Catherine of Aragon had not, a living son. In September 1533, Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. To the king's disappointment, the long-awaited heir was not a boy. Yet for Mary Boleyn, watching from the shadows, that small child would one day secure the legacy of her own children. For Elizabeth and the Careys would grow together, threads of kinship and trust binding them more tightly than the world realized. While Anne fought desperately to maintain her hold on Henry's favor, Mary lived quietly, far from courtly spectacle. Yet fate did not allow her to remain untouched. The downfall of Anne in 1536 sent shockwaves through England. The Queen was accused of adultery, treason, even incest with her own brother George. The charges were grotesque, carefully designed to obliterate not just Anne, but the entire Boleyn family's influence. Mary, however, stood apart. She had already been cast out. She had already severed her ties to the dangerous ambitions that devoured her kin, and perhaps that distance saved her. While her sister was executed in May 1536, Mary survived, quietly holding on to her fragile existence. The contrast between the two sisters was stark. Anne had reached dazzling heights only to plummet into the abyss, her name forever etched in tragedy. Mary had stumbled earlier, fallen from favor, and retreated into obscurity. Yet, in that obscurity lay safety. As the court roared with the drama of Anne's death and Henry's hasty remarriage, Mary remained untouched, tending to her children, Catherine and Henry, whose fates were quietly unfolding. Catherine Carey, the elder, inherited her mother's gentle beauty, but also displayed resilience that suggested the iron of her Howard ancestry. She entered the household of Princess Elizabeth, forging a bond with the girl who would later become queen. Catherine became Elizabeth's confidant, her most trusted lady, so close that some would later whisper she was more than just a cousin, perhaps even a sister in truth, if the rumors of her royal paternity were to be believed. That closeness, forged in childhood, endured for decades, and Elizabeth rewarded Catherine's loyalty with affection and favor unmatched by any other lady of her court. Henry Carey, Mary's son, likewise rose steadily. Though never acknowledged as a royal bastard, he received lands, titles, and responsibilities that suggested the crown looked upon him with more than ordinary kindness. Under Elizabeth, he became Baron Hunsdon, head of the Queen's household troops, a man trusted with her very safety. It was a position of extraordinary confidence, one not lightly given. If Henry Carey was indeed Henry VIII's son, Elizabeth was entrusting her security to her half-brother. If not, then the trust was still remarkable, for it demonstrated how deeply Elizabeth cherished the blood of Mary Boleyn. Meanwhile, Mary herself aged in the shadows. The records do not reveal her thoughts as Anne was executed, as her family fell from power, as the court shifted with Henry's endless marriages. We can only imagine her relief that she had chosen a quiet path, her sorrow for the sister she once loved and later estranged, her uncertainty about the world her children were stepping into. In those years, she must have reflected on her youth, on the days in France, on the dangerous glances of kings, on the whispered promises of power that had come to nothing. Perhaps she even understood, more than anyone, the brutal truth of Tudor ambition, that to rise was to risk everything, and to fall was almost inevitable. Mary's own life ended in 1543, just as Henry VIII's health was collapsing, and the kingdom was bracing for the uncertainty of his succession. She died quietly, without scandal, without spectacle, far from the bloody theater that had consumed her family. Yet even in death, she left behind a legacy that could not be erased, for her children stood poised at the threshold of greatness, woven invisibly into the fate of England. In the years to come, as Elizabeth Tudor seized the throne in 1558, the memory of Mary Boleyn stirred once more. Elizabeth surrounded herself with those she trusted most, and at the center of her circle were Catherine and Henry Carey. Through them, Mary's presence lingered. Though her name was rarely spoken, her blood, her choices, and her quiet survival had shaped the Queen's most intimate world. Elizabeth's reign, the golden age of England, was in part guarded and guided by the descendants of a woman history had nearly erased. It is here, in this paradox, that Mary Boleyn's story acquires its haunting power. She was remembered by contemporaries as frivolous, even shamed as a discarded mistress. She was overshadowed by her brilliant sister, dismissed by her ambitious family, abandoned by the chronicles. Yet in the silence of her exile, she became the matriarch of a lineage that would safeguard a queen and continue through centuries, reaching into the veins of modern royalty. And so the tale twists upon itself. The forgotten sister, mocked and scorned, becomes the hidden thread of continuity, while the celebrated sister becomes a tragic cautionary tale. The Tudor court thrived on such ironies, feeding upon the rise and ruin of those who sought power. But in Mary's case, obscurity proved more enduring than glory. She had not sought the throne, yet through her children, she helped to secure it. As we step further into her story, the whispers grow louder. Were Catherine and Henry Carey truly the offspring of Henry VIII, their veins carrying the secret blood of a king? Did Elizabeth cherish them as kin not only by marriage but by birth? The records remain silent, but silence itself can speak volumes. In a court where Henry VIII acknowledged only one illegitimate son, the extraordinary favor granted to the Careys raises questions that no historian can fully silence. Mary Boleyn's life, then, is not merely the story of a forgotten beauty. It is the story of how desire, scandal, and exile became the foundation of hidden dynastic power. It is a tale that reminds us that history's shadows often conceal the most enduring truths, and that sometimes the greatest influence is carried not in crowns or titles, but in the bloodlines that flow quietly beneath. When Mary Boleyn breathed her last in 1543, the world took little notice. She left no great estates, no titles that would echo in heraldic rolls, no place at the center of chronicles that celebrated queens and martyrs. She departed almost quietly, a woman who had once been the king's mistress and then slipped into silence. Yet while Mary's passing was overlooked, her children were just beginning to shape the stage upon which the Tudor dynasty's survival would play out. Catherine Carey, born in 1524, had inherited her mother's softness of expression, but beneath that gentleness was a resilience that reflected the iron will of the Howard blood, and perhaps something more mysterious. From her earliest years, she moved in the orbit of royalty. She was kin by blood to the Boleyns, kin by proximity to the Tudors, and, if whispers were true, kin by paternity to the king himself. That question of her father's identity, though never answered, seemed to shadow her every step. For how else to explain the extraordinary favor that unfolded across her life? As a young girl, Catherine entered the household of Princess Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn. The bond formed between them became one of the most enduring and intimate of Elizabeth's life. While courtiers jostled for position and nobles schemed for influence, Catherine's place was secure, not through calculation but through affection. Elizabeth leaned upon her, confided in her, trusted her with secrets that others could only dream of hearing. When Elizabeth ascended the throne in 1558, Catherine's loyalty was repaid with elevation. She became the Queen's chief lady of the bedchamber, a position of remarkable intimacy, for it meant she was present at the Queen's most private moments, dressing, undressing, the quiet silences of dawn and the hushed conversations of midnight. Few women or men held such influence over Elizabeth. In Catherine's presence, the Queen was not simply the Virgin Queen, but Elizabeth the woman, fragile, uncertain, searching for comfort in a world that demanded she be iron. Catherine became her anchor. In portraits and letters, Elizabeth's warmth toward her cousin is evident, and contemporaries marveled at the closeness. Some even whispered that the bond was blood deep, that Catherine was not merely a cousin, but the Queen's half-sister, born of Henry VIII's secret liaison with Mary Boleyn. Elizabeth herself, though she never declared it, seemed to nurture Catherine with a tenderness that suggested more than political utility. Henry Carey, Catherine's brother, followed a path shaped less by intimacy and more by duty. He grew into a man of stature and martial vigor, embodying the chivalric ideals Henry VIII had once championed in his own youth. Though never publicly acknowledged as royal, Henry Carey's career flourished with opportunities that seemed reserved for those favored by the crown. Elizabeth raised him to the peerage as Baron Hunsdon, granting him not only a title but the weight of authority. He was entrusted with the command of the Queen's household troops, a role of immense responsibility, for it meant he was charged with her personal safety. The symbolism of this trust was striking. Elizabeth, who had survived conspiracies, rebellion, and assassination plots, placed her life in the hands of Henry Carey. Was it because he was her cousin? Was it because he was her half-brother? Or was it simply that his loyalty had proven unshakable? Whatever the reason, Henry became one of the most steadfast guardians of her reign, his presence at court a reminder that the blood of Mary Boleyn still coursed powerfully in Tudor affairs. Together, Catherine and Henry Carey formed a kind of living legacy for their mother. Though Mary herself had been cast aside, her children stood at the very heart of Elizabeth's golden age. They were not mere courtiers, but pillars of stability, woven into the fabric of the Queen's daily life. In them, the shadows of Mary's liaison with Henry VIII seemed to flicker back into light. And yet their prominence stirred questions that could never be safely asked aloud. If Catherine and Henry Carey were indeed the offspring of Henry VIII, then Elizabeth's reign rested upon a foundation of concealed kinship. The Queen's most trusted lady and her closest military guardian would, in that case, not only be her cousins but her half-siblings. The thought must have crossed Elizabeth's mind, though she spoke of it to no one. To admit it would have been to expose the secrets of her father, to complicate the legitimacy she herself so carefully guarded. Silence, therefore, was the only choice. But silence does not kill rumor. It feeds it. In the taverns, in the households of minor nobles, in the margins of chronicles, whispers persisted. The Tudors were masters of spectacle, yet behind every spectacle lurked the possibility of concealed truths. Catherine's favor, Henry's trust, the extraordinary longevity of their influence all pointed to something more than mere kinship through Mary Boleyn. Catherine's own family extended this hidden power further. She married Sir Francis Knollys, a staunch Protestant who became a powerful figure under Elizabeth. Together they had no fewer than 16 children, a brood that spread across the kingdom like seeds of loyalty. Their daughters and sons married into noble families, entered royal service, and became part of the great network that underpinned Elizabeth's reign. Through Catherine, Mary Boleyn became the matriarch of a dynasty that stretched across the Elizabethan court, her grandchildren rising as courtiers, soldiers, and statesmen. Henry Carey, too, expanded the reach of Mary's legacy. His descendants carried the Boleyn blood into yet more noble houses, intertwining with the great families of England. Through these lines, Mary's blood reached into centuries beyond her own, flowing eventually into the veins of modern royals, linking a forgotten mistress of Henry VIII to the princes and princesses of our age. The irony is almost too rich. Mary Boleyn, once dismissed as a frivolous beauty, became the grandmother of England's Elizabethan establishment, the ancestress of dukes, earls, and monarchs. Her sister Anne had burned brightly and been extinguished, her line ending with Elizabeth, who left no heirs. But Mary, the forgotten one, the discarded mistress, carried the dynasty forward. It was her children, not Anne's, who ensured the survival of Boleyn blood. Elizabeth, perhaps, understood this irony better than anyone. She had seen her mother destroyed, her legitimacy questioned, her throne threatened. In Catherine and Henry Carey, she saw not only loyalty but continuity, a quiet assurance that the family her mother had represented still endured. She surrounded herself with them not only because she trusted them, but because they reminded her of who she was, of the blood that pulsed through her veins, of the precarious legacy she carried. The presence of the Careys at Elizabeth's side also had political implications. Their Protestant convictions reinforced Elizabeth's religious settlement, their networks of kinship extended her reach into the noble classes, and their sheer numbers, thanks to Catherine's brood, created a web of allegiance that was difficult for rivals to challenge. Through them, Mary Boleyn's legacy became not just personal, but political. And yet, Mary herself was rarely spoken of. In the glittering halls of Whitehall, in the crowded chambers of Hampton Court, her name was absent from the pageants and masques. The chroniclers celebrated Elizabeth's virginity, her triumph over Spain, her glittering court of poets and adventurers. They did not speak of Mary, the quiet matriarch behind the Queen's most trusted servants. History, as it so often does, chose the louder story, the tragic fall of Anne, the splendor of Elizabeth, over the softer, subtler tale of the woman who had given birth to the Queen's protectors. But sometimes silence is more eloquent than words. The very absence of Mary's name, the deliberate forgetting of her, suggests a secret too dangerous to voice. If indeed her children were Henry VIII's blood, then Mary was not simply a discarded mistress, but the unacknowledged mother of royal bastards who shaped the Tudor succession. To remember her fully would have been to unravel the careful fabric of legitimacy Elizabeth wore as armor. And so Mary remained a ghost, present in the flesh of her children, absent in the chronicles of power. As Elizabeth's reign stretched into its later decades, Catherine Carey aged beside her. The bond between them never weakened, and when Catherine died in 1569, the Queen was devastated. Elizabeth, who rarely allowed her emotions to show, was said to have mourned deeply, withdrawing into grief for the woman who had been her closest companion. It was not the mourning of a distant cousin, but of someone who had lost a sister, or perhaps something even closer. The depth of Elizabeth's sorrow gave new life to old whispers. For why should the Queen grieve so fiercely unless the tie had been more than kinship through the Boleyns? Henry Carey lived longer, continuing to serve Elizabeth with unwavering loyalty. Even as age slowed him, he remained a figure of trust, a man whose very presence reassured the Queen of her safety. In 1596, as his health declined, Elizabeth visited him on his deathbed, an extraordinary gesture for a monarch whose time was so jealously guarded. She is said to have pressed his hand, her face etched with sorrow, a final farewell to the man who had been her protector, perhaps her brother. His passing left a void at her side, a reminder that time was stripping away the last living links to the world of her youth and the shadowed secrets of her lineage. By the time Elizabeth herself died in 1603, the story of Mary Boleyn had long since been buried beneath louder histories. Yet the bloodline endured, carried through Catherine's children and Henry's descendants, flowing forward into Stuart and Hanoverian veins, and finally, centuries later, into the Windsor line itself. The irony was complete. The forgotten sister, the scorned mistress, the woman mocked by kings and dismissed by her family, had become the ancestress of monarchs. Mary Boleyn's life, when pieced together, reads like a riddle wrapped in silence. She was remembered as promiscuous, dismissed as frivolous, overshadowed by her sister. Yet she was also a mother whose children became indispensable to a queen, a woman whose bloodline would outlast all the Tudors who once scorned her. Her story is one of shadows, but shadows are often where truth hides. The mystery remains. Were Catherine and Henry Carey truly the offspring of Henry VIII? The documents will never tell us, for the Tudors were masters at erasing inconvenient truths. But the legacy of favor, trust, and continuity points us toward an answer history dares not speak aloud. The children of Mary Boleyn were not only her redemption, they were the hidden foundation of Elizabeth's reign, the quiet bridge between the brilliance of Anne and the endurance of the dynasty. And so Mary's tale continues, not as a footnote but as a hidden chronicle, reminding us that the forgotten often shape history more profoundly than the celebrated. She is the ghost in Elizabeth's story, the secret in the Tudor bloodline, the silent mother of power. When Elizabeth I drew her last breath on that grey March morning in 1603, an age ended. The Tudor line, once fierce and unshakable, collapsed into silence. Anne Boleyn's daughter left no heir. The dynasty that had risen from Henry VII's cautious claim and Henry VIII's ruthless will had burned brilliantly and then flickered out. But though the Tudor crown passed to the Scottish Stuarts, the story of Mary Boleyn's children had only begun to unfold, for if Anne's line ended with Elizabeth, Mary's bloodline endured. Her children, Catherine and Henry Carey, had already sown generations of descendants across England. Their offspring would marry into noble houses, carry titles, and shape the aristocracy of the coming centuries. The irony could not have been greater. The sister who was forgotten in her own lifetime became the progenitor of England's future, while the sister who wore a crown left nothing behind but memory. Catherine Carey's vast brood, 16 children, ensured that her mother's legacy spread widely. Her marriage to Sir Francis Knollys had bound her to one of the great Protestant families of the realm. During Elizabeth's reign, the Knollys clan was a backbone of Protestant politics, supplying courtiers, diplomats, and soldiers. Catherine's sons and daughters married strategically, binding the Boleyn bloodline to other houses that would rise in the Stuart age. Through them, Mary Boleyn's influence seeped into the very fabric of England's political elite. One of Catherine's daughters, Lettice Knollys, became notorious in her own right. She married Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, Elizabeth's lifelong favourite. The match provoked the Queen's fury, for Elizabeth considered Dudley hers alone, the one man she might have loved beyond politics. Lettice's marriage was viewed as a betrayal, and Elizabeth banished her from court. Yet, despite the Queen's wrath, Lettice lived on, her line enduring long after Elizabeth was gone. Through her, Mary Boleyn's blood touched the Dudley inheritance, intertwining with the ambitions and tragedies of yet another great family. Henry Carey's descendants also flourished. Raised to the peerage as Baron Hunsdon, he passed his title to his heirs, who carried it into the Stuart period. The Careys remained close to the monarchy, their loyalty continuing to bind them to the crown. In a sense, the dynasty of Mary Boleyn became a shadow dynasty, never crowned but always present, never central but always essential. As James VI of Scotland ascended the English throne as James I, Uniting the crowns of England and Scotland, the courtiers around him were not merely strangers. Among them stood men and women who carried Mary Boleyn's blood. They were not Tudors in name, but in blood they bore a hidden claim, however tenuous, to the legacy of Henry VIII. It was a claim no one dared articulate, for James's legitimacy as the heir of Henry's elder sister, Margaret Tudor, had to remain unchallenged. But history has a way of weaving its patterns regardless of words. The Stuarts themselves would soon face turmoil, civil wars, regicide, restoration, revolution. Yet, through the chaos, Mary Boleyn's descendants endured. They married, they bore children, they quietly extended their branches into the noble forest of England. With each generation, the blood of Mary, and perhaps of Henry VIII, seeped deeper into the nation's aristocracy. By the time of the Hanoverians, when George I came from Germany to assume the throne in 1714, Mary's descendants were everywhere: lords in Parliament, ladies at court, generals in the army. She had been erased from Tudor chronicles, but her legacy had become impossible to erase from England itself. It is almost uncanny how her line persisted where others faltered. Anna Boleyn's story ended in tragedy, Elizabeth's in childless glory, Henry VIII's sons in early graves or fragile legacies. Yet Mary's children, quietly and steadily, carried her blood through the storms of history. The Carey and Knollys lines multiplied, joining with the Spencers, the Cavendishes, the Cecils. With each marriage, Mary's legacy deepened, connecting her to the beating heart of England's ruling class. In time, this web reached the Spencers, one of the most illustrious families of later centuries. Through them, Mary Boleyn's bloodline would flow into the veins of Diana, Princess of Wales, and from Diana into her sons, Prince William and Prince Harry. If the whispers about Catherine and Henry Carey's true father were true, then Mary Boleyn is not merely an ancestress of nobles, she is the ancestress of today's royal heirs. The irony is staggering. Henry VIII, who obsessed over sons and heirs, who destroyed wives and kingdoms in pursuit of a male successor, may have unknowingly achieved his goal through an illegitimate line that survives in the very princes who are next in line for Britain's throne. But to return to the 17th century, when the Civil War tore England apart, Mary's descendants again played their roles. Some sided with Parliament, others with the king, their loyalties divided like the nation itself. Yet, whichever side they chose, the Boleyn blood was present at every turning point, at Naseby, at Edgehill, at Whitehall during the execution of Charles I. Men with Mary's blood witnessed the convulsions of the monarchy she had once touched so intimately. Even in exile and restoration, her legacy persisted. When Charles II returned to the throne in 1660, the aristocracy that welcomed him back included dozens of Mary's descendants. They were not the ones who wore crowns, but they were the ones who shaped courts, influenced policy, and guided armies. Quietly, subtly, Mary's ghost walked with them. What, then, do we make of this endurance? Mary herself left behind no writings, no confessions, no direct testimony of her feelings. We cannot know whether she considered herself a failure or a survivor, whether she mourned the loss of her sister or found solace in the quiet life she chose. But her blood spoke louder than any words she might have written. It survived, thrived, and entwined itself with the destiny of Britain. The irony sharpens when we recall Henry VIII's obsession with succession. He divorced Catherine of Aragon, executed Anne Boleyn, discarded Anne of Cleves, humiliated Catherine Howard, and left Catherine Parr widowed, all in pursuit of a son who would secure the Tudor line. Yet the one mistress he never acknowledged, Mary Boleyn, may have given him precisely what he sought: children whose line would outlast all his official heirs. The Tudors ended in 1603, but if Catherine and Henry Carey carried his blood, the Tudors never truly died. They simply changed their name, their titles, their place in history's memory. Elizabeth, who ruled with iron and brilliance, may have known this in her heart. Her closeness to Catherine and Henry Carey suggests an awareness too deep to be dismissed as coincidence. She leaned upon them not only for loyalty but for identity. In their faces she might have seen echoes of her father, reflections of her own blood, a reassurance that she was not as alone as her virginity proclaimed. Her reign, golden and enduring, was guarded by the children of her mother's rival and her father's mistress. The paradox is almost Shakespearean, as though destiny itself had woven irony into every thread of Tudor history. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Mary's name had faded almost entirely from public memory, but her blood was closer to the throne than ever. The Carey descendants intermarried with the great houses, producing statesmen, generals, and duchesses. The line continued quietly until it emerged again, dramatically, in the 20th century through Diana Spencer. When Diana married Prince Charles, heir to the throne, she carried with her centuries of hidden history. The forgotten mistress of Henry VIII stood, through blood and lineage, at the altar of St. Paul's in 1981, and when Diana's son William was born, the Boleyn blood, Mary's blood, flowed directly into the line of succession once more. Thus, Mary's story becomes not only one of Tudor intrigue, but of dynastic irony across centuries. The woman mocked as the English mare in France, the mistress cast aside by Henry, the sister despised by Anne, the widow who married for love and was banished for it, she became the matriarch of modern royalty. Her life seemed to end in obscurity, but her blood never left the stage. It has outlived kingdoms, dynasties, and empires, and it beats still in the veins of heirs to Britain's crown. Her tale is a reminder that history does not always reward the boldest, nor preserve the brightest. Sometimes it is the forgotten who shape the future most profoundly. Mary Boleyn, the shadowed sister, the discarded mistress, is proof of that. And as we trace her line through Catherine and Henry Carey, through the Knollys, the Spencers, and beyond, we see that her legacy was not silence but endurance. She survived the storm of Tudor ambition by retreating into obscurity, but in that obscurity she planted seeds that would outlive the Tudors themselves. When we speak of Mary Boleyn, then, we speak not of failure but of continuity, not of shame but of survival, not of a footnote but of a foundation. Her story, long overlooked, is one of the great hidden narratives of English history, a story that stretches from the gilded chambers of Henry VIII's court to the gilded weddings of modern monarchs, unbroken, unstoppable, and unforgettable. The legacy of Mary Boleyn is like a thread of gold stitched into a tapestry that, at first glance, seems dark and frayed. For centuries, her name slipped through the margins of history. She was remembered not as a woman of power, not as a queen or a martyr, but as a discarded mistress, a sister overshadowed by Anne's tragic brilliance. Yet, when we follow the thread of her descendants, when we trace the generations that came after Catherine and Henry Carey, we find that her obscurity concealed a truth more enduring than any crown. Mary Boleyn's blood never left the throne of England. Her children's lives had already become intertwined with Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen. But as the Stuart dynasty took hold, the Carey and Knollys lines continued to spread. They wove themselves into the peerage, their marriages linking them to families that would rise and fall with the great shifts of English politics. In the corridors of Whitehall and the halls of Parliament, the descendants of Mary Boleyn carried their legacy quietly but persistently. No coronation proclaimed their presence, no public pageant celebrated their blood. But they were there, unseen architects of continuity in a monarchy obsessed with survival. When civil war shattered England in the 17th century, Mary's descendants fought on both sides. Some bore arms for Parliament, others remained loyal to the king. Their loyalties may have divided, but their bloodline did not. And when the monarchy returned in triumph with Charles II, the noble houses that welcomed him back were already threaded through with the legacy of Mary Boleyn. The irony was sharper than ever. Though the Tudors had vanished, the woman they had once tried to forget had left behind a lineage impossible to erase. Through Lettice Knollys, Catherine Careys' daughter, the blood of Mary Boleyn passed into branches that touched the Earls of Leicester and beyond. Through Henry Careys' heirs, the line endured in noble titles, sometimes fading into the background, sometimes emerging in positions of influence. Over the generations, the name Boleyn faded, but the inheritance remained. By the 18th century, when the Hanoverians replaced the Stuarts, Mary's descendants were deeply embedded in the political and social elite. It was as though the forgotten mistress had become the matriarch of an invisible dynasty, one that did not need crowns to survive. Henry VIII's obsession with heirs had driven him to destroy wives, sunder his kingdom from Rome, and execute friends and foes alike. Yet in the end, his legitimate male line failed. Edward VI died young. Mary I left no child. Elizabeth I, the last Tudor, died a virgin. Henry's grand design collapsed. But if Catherine and Henry Carey were indeed his children, then his heirs lived on quietly in Mary's line. He had achieved in secret what he could not achieve in law. His bloodline, denied in proclamations, triumphed in time, and the cruelest irony of all was that it triumphed not through Anne, the sister he had destroyed his kingdom to possess, but through Mary, the sister he discarded. This irony deepens as we move forward into the modern age. Through the Carey and Knollys lines, Mary's blood reached the Spencers, one of the greatest families of England. Centuries after Mary's death, her blood surfaced in Diana, Princess of Wales, whose marriage to Prince Charles brought her once more to the heart of monarchy. In Diana, the gentle beauty of Mary Boleyn seemed to echo across the centuries, the same sweetness, the same air of tragedy. Just as Mary had been adored and then cast aside, Diana too was embraced and then broken by the demands of crown and country. History, it seemed, had repeated its cruel pattern. Yet Diana left something Mary had also left: children who would endure. Through Prince William and Prince Harry, the line of Mary Boleyn stands once more in direct succession to the throne. If Catherine and Henry Carey carried Henry VIII's blood, then William and Harry carry it too. The boy who will one day be king, Prince William, may in fact represent the ultimate fulfillment of Henry VIII's dream, the survival of his bloodline through the woman he never acknowledged. What does this mean for how we understand Mary Boleyn? For centuries she was cast as a figure of scandal, a cautionary tale of female frivolity in a dangerous court. She was the sister who surrendered too easily, the mistress who left no mark. Yet when we measure influence not by words spoken or crowns worn, but by blood that endures, her story surpasses even Anne's. Anne left a daughter who shaped an age but left no heirs. Mary left children who shaped centuries, weaving their mother's forgotten name into the veins of kings and princes. Perhaps this is why her story carries such an air of mystery. It is not only the question of paternity, though that remains a tantalizing shadow, but the question of how history chooses to remember. Why was Mary forgotten while Anne was immortalized? Why was the quiet survivor erased while the doomed queen became a legend? Perhaps it was deliberate. The Tudors, masters of propaganda, knew that stories shaped power. Anne's downfall was a warning, Elizabeth's reign a triumph. Mary's life, neither tragedy nor spectacle, was left untold. Yet it is precisely in that silence that her power resided. By living quietly, by stepping away from the dangerous stage, she preserved the legacy that her louder sister destroyed. There is also something profoundly human in her story. Mary did not live for politics or crowns. When she married William Stafford in secret, she chose love over ambition, a choice almost unheard of for a woman of her station. That choice cost her everything at court, but may have saved her in the long run. While Anne was executed, George Boleyn beheaded, and the rest of her family disgraced, Mary lived on, quietly, peacefully, raising the children who would carry her story into the future. In a world where survival was rare, Mary achieved it. And in survival, she achieved victory. The question of Catherine and Henry Careys' paternity will never be answered. Historians debate it endlessly, some pointing to the timing of their births, others to the favors they received, still others to the silence that surrounded them. But whether or not they were Henry VIII's children, their impact was undeniable. They stood at Elizabeth's side, shaping her court, supporting her reign, and ensuring the stability of a monarchy that might otherwise have faltered. Their descendants carried that stability into the ages, until Mary's blood became part of the very institution that had once scorned her. Today, when we watch the royal family step onto balconies, when we see the faces of princes and princesses in newspapers and broadcasts, we are also seeing the legacy of Mary Boleyn. She is there, invisible yet undeniable, in the line of succession, in the continuation of monarchy. Her story reminds us that history is not only written in battles and coronations, but in the quiet endurance of bloodlines that refuse to die. Mary Boleyn's life was marked by scandal, by exile, by obscurity, but her legacy was marked by survival, endurance, and triumph. She is the great paradox of Tudor history, forgotten yet unforgettable, discarded yet enduring, mocked yet victorious. In her children, in their children, and in the generations that followed, Mary ensured that her name would one day be remembered not as a cautionary tale, but as the foundation of a dynasty. And so, when we look back at the Tudor age, we must look beyond the glitter of Anne's rise and fall, beyond the grandeur of Henry's power, beyond the glory of Elizabeth's reign. We must look into the shadows, into the quiet life of a woman who chose love over ambition, and in doing so, secured a legacy greater than all of them. Mary Boleyn, the forgotten sister, the discarded mistress, the gentle beauty mocked by kings, became the ancestress of monarchs. Her story is not merely a footnote, it is the secret heartbeat of English history. The mystery will always remain. Did Henry VIII's blood truly pass through Catherine and Henry Carey into the veins of princes and queens? Or was Mary's legacy entirely her own, unassisted by the king's seed? Perhaps we will never know, but perhaps that is the point. For history thrives on its enigmas, and Mary's enigma is one that stretches across centuries. It invites us to wonder, to imagine, to see in her story not just scandal but destiny. And in that destiny lies the ultimate irony. The woman forgotten by her own age has become unforgettable in ours. The woman dismissed by her family has become the ancestor of families that still rule. The woman scorned as a mistress has become the mother of kings. Mary Boleyn, the beautiful, the gentle, the forgotten, stands at last revealed not as a shadow but as a cornerstone. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.